we've been talking about cybernetics and how, the sort of the antecedents of cybernetics and how there's this legacy of cybernetics, especially for artificial intelligence and some other areas of science. Norbert Wiener, of course, was a main figure in cybernetics, and he had, of course, we've talked about his arc of intellectual production, and it's really fascinating. He's not just a cybernetics person; he did a lot of work on information theory and some other areas of science and engineering as well. This is a Medium article. This is by a CEO of AI Soma AG. I'm not familiar with that, but it was an interesting little article. Norbert Wiener's understated legacy in the age of AI. So this is, of course, generated by DALL-E. It's a picture of an old Norbert Wiener, I guess, with chalkboards and so forth. So the article talks about sort of Norbert Wiener's influence on AI research, which is not necessarily apparent to people from kind of at first glance. He did, of course, the book The Human Use of Human Machines, which we went through chapter by chapter in our cybernetics reading group. He also did a lot of things on information theory, did a lot of things on cybernetics and feedback. And so all those things are kind of setting up sort of modern AI research, but also sort of modern cognitive science, because modern cognitive science uses this sort of cybernetics view of things. And so this is, definitely a worldview that Wiener sort of was at the formative cusp of, and so this is something that we would like to know more about. So Norbert Wiener's work has a lasting influence on AI research, but unfortunately is less well known to the general public. Norbert Wiener was a mathematician and philosopher who made several significant contributions to the development of artificial intelligence. Wiener's most crucial contribution to artificial intelligence was the development of cybernetics, which created some of the theoretical foundations for modern artificial intelligence. Cybernetics dealt with the control and communication of machines and living organisms, and was an interdisciplinary field that drew on insights from mathematics, engineering, biology, and psychology. So, we've talked about the cognitive science hexagon, which has it's a shape that has at each point, at each sort of vertex, a field of study. So, cognitive science, I don't remember all the 6 fields that contribute to cognitive science. It's like philosophy, mathematics, psychology, anthropology, computer science, and one more, or linguistics, I guess. And so, cybernetics has the same structure, where these different input domains, these different input fields, and they contribute to the interdisciplinary field. So it's, I don't know if you want to overlap cybernetics with cognitive science, so the cybernetics cube or square with the cognitive science hexagon, you're welcome to do that. It would be interesting to compare. As Wiener astutely observed, we have changed the world more than we have changed our way of thinking, and the new way of thinking is still partly that of the preceding stage. This is actually an important point for what we were talking about with respect to the reading group, the history of cybernetics, and that is, the purpose of that 1943 paper was to sort of change the way of thinking. So it's not enough to just kind of introduce ideas into the bloodstream of the intellectual world or into a field. You have to kind of change the way of thinking. You have to propose maybe how terms should be redefined, or how, like this last paper we talked about, to remind people that we're, what the fundamental challenge actually is, because sometimes people lose sight of this. Sometimes a lot of ideas get interpreted, and there are a lot of sort of atavistic ideas about, say, communication and control that persist. And so, sometimes you need to write a paper to remind people that this is a fundamentally new thing we're dealing with here. I'm talking about 1943, not in today's thinking. But so we need to really kind of reframe everything. We need to reframe everything we've been thinking about before. We can't just take our old ideas and move them into the future. We can't just take human analogs of thinking or change over time and just kind of work with those. We need to kind of fundamentally rethink those. So in this quote, Wiener predicted the trajectory of technology and the human propensity to underappreciate the frameworks that fundamentally reshape our existence. Wiener's work on cybernetics was based on the idea that machines and living organisms can be viewed as information processing systems that rely on feedback and control mechanisms to remain stable and adapt to changing conditions. So this is like where we talk about homeostasis and allostasis and things like that, much more than just that simple feedback and control mechanism. Norbert Wiener's work on cybernetics and feedback laid some theoretical foundations for artificial intelligence. His insights into the similarities between biological and mechanical systems have significantly influenced its development, and his concepts of feedback and control remain fundamental in the development of modern intelligent machines. I think Wiener would like this quote. Artificial intelligence is highly interdisciplinary. Therefore, let's approach it as a multidisciplinary and holistic discipline. And so I'm paraphrasing that, but it's still interesting. And then there's this book, Cybernetics, second edition, where the control and communication in the animal and machine. So that's that article. So it's interesting, kind of a motivation for this paper, which I found. This is a paper from Steven Strogatz, and this is Norbert Wiener's Brainwaves. I thought that would be a nice way to finish up the meeting. Kind of stitching together some of Wiener's work that's maybe inside of cybernetics and some that's outside of cybernetics, since Wiener did a lot of work on signal processing as well. And so this is basically discussing his work in this area. So this is the introduction. Let's see if I can zoom in here. Okay. In the late 1950s, Norbert Wiener became interested in the spectrum of human brain waves. So he published some papers in the late 50s and early 60s. Along with his medical collaborators, he made high-resolution encephalographic recordings from subjects who were awake but resting with their eyes closed. Under these conditions, the electroencephalogram showed conspicuous activity at frequencies around 10 Hz, or the so-called alpha rhythm. Figure 1, which I'll show you in a minute, shows Wiener's sketch of the magnified spectrum around 10 Hz. He writes, "It would have been quite conceivable that there would not be a phenomenon of that sort. For example, it might have been that all of our work on the fine structure of the brain waves is wasted. However, once we find this effect, we are under an obligation to try and give an explanation of it. There are two things that are striking here. One is the very narrow line at the center of the spectrum, and the other is that this line arises from a dip. So let's look at this figure 1. So this actually looks like a wavelet. I think the Mexican hat wavelet specifically, but this is basically what he's discovering in human alpha waves. So this is the frequency, this is the 10 Hz band here, there's a maximum here, and then it falls off around 10 Hz. And then there's this dip on either side of 10 Hz, and then there's this increase in going sort of up in frequency and down in frequency. There's these secondary peaks, and then there's this fall off after that. So these are human alpha waves. This is what they discover in their work. This is the schematic sketch. So it's basically the idealized wave, but this is basically what they're looking at. And again, it's, it's interesting because, why does it do this? You would think, well, okay, there's some peak at a certain frequency and then it falls off and that's it. But this is something that, is not a normal distribution. And, maybe you shouldn't expect to find those in time series or, in the frequency band, but that's what we have. So to explain the spectrum, Wiener hypothesized that there is a population of oscillators in the brain whose intrinsic frequencies are close to 10 hertz, and that these oscillators constitute a more accurate oscillator and mass than they do singly. So that means that you have in this frequency portrait, you have a bunch of things underlying the signal. So you're recording a signal from a site, you have this 10 hertz band, and because there are a lot of things contributing to it, you have this complex function. And so it's actually, these oscillators are kind of operating at this frequency close to 10 hertz, and if you average it out, you get to 10 hertz. And it's a nice, neat marker, and it has like a lot of significance in the brain, I guess. But the point is that it's not produced by a single signal. It's actually the product of a number of oscillators, kind of operating maybe stochastically, but kind of collectively giving you this 10 hertz signal. The idea is that the oscillators interact by pulling on each other's frequencies. So they're interacting as well as producing independent signals. So if an oscillator is ahead of the group tends to slow it down. So Stephen Sturgatz has been interested in synchronization his entire career. He wrote this book, Sync, about 20 years ago, where he was talking about a lot of the stuff that people do when they study firefly synchronization. So fireflies will synchronize their flashing activity, and they'll do it by communicating with each other and using the signal as their luciferase signal as a way to synchronize each other's flashes. So this is something that we also see in like the Kuramoto oscillator, which is a model of different neurons oscillating in a population. And each neuron is influencing other neurons in that population. So basically, the oscillators are behaving in a way that's regulating the entire average. And so what you see in this trace is where this is kind of, this is an active process. It's not something that happens automatically. It happens kind of dynamically, and sometimes you never get to the actual average. But you can see that the average behavior of the oscillators is at 10 hertz, and then there's some variation around the edge. And so these dips represent places where, you have less activity. And it's just because they're operating around this mean, and there's this space where, as they're correcting each other, where they are less likely to inhabit. So you're basically describing sort of this complex system in this simple trace. If it's going too slowly, the group tends to speed it up. In this way, the population of oscillators can achieve a collective enhancement of precision. This is basically also the way that the collective movement of bird flocks are described. If you go back to some of the models of collective behavior in bird flocks, basically the way people formalize this is that birds exist in this flock, that individual birds will kind of behave, and then they'll monitor the behavior of their nearest neighbors. And so the way that bird flocks are sort of coherent and stable is that they just basically slow down when the neighbors slow down and speed up when their neighbors speed up. And so they correct themselves to the average or the mean of the group. And so this just propagates across these, individual birds communicating with their nearest neighbors, and propagates throughout the flock until you get this coordination of the flock. And of course, you'll see this mean behavior, but you also see these weird transitional states. which actually allow the flock to recover to another stable state. So this portrait here that we see, you could extrapolate this out to other types of synchronized behaviors as well. Wiener tried to support his notion via frequency polling with the experimental evidence available in those days. For instance, he mentions an amazing experiment involving direct electrical driving of the brain. A sheet of tin was suspended from the ceiling and connected to one terminal of a 400-volt 10 Hz generator. He writes that this apparatus can produce electrostatic induction in anything in the room, and that it can actually drive the brain, causing a decidedly unpleasant sensation. I bet it would. So this is an experimental kind of setup that he made for this. It is probably wise to take Wiener's experimental claims with a grain of salt. He rarely shows or cites actual data. Figure 11 in Wiener in 1961 is the lone exception, and as far as I know, no one has ever replicated his results. Wiener 1958 also attempted to account for his observations mathematically, but his approach was awkward and led nowhere. However, he did leave an important legacy. He was the first to propose studying the collective behavior of biological oscillators. So this again was sort of the basis for some of the synchronization work that came later. So Wiener's work was 1958, 1961, and then this led to people like Art Winfrey, who published in 1967, 1980, 1987. He did a lot of things with, wrote this book, The Geometry of Biological Time. He also did a lot of work with oscillators. These oscillators range from chemical oscillators to neuronal oscillators to other types of collective behavior. So examples include pacemaker cells in the heart, glycotic synchrony in yeast cell suspensions, collective oscillations in pancreatic beta cells, synchronously flashing fireflies, crickets that chirp in unison, and women's menstrual cycles become mutually synchronized. So these are all examples of this sort of type of mutual synchronization. So where Wiener kind of couldn't land the fish, these other groups had worked on very specific systems and actually had made quite a bit of progress in this topic. And again, there's this assumption of universality where you have all these different types of systems and they are all driven by this, I guess, I wouldn't want to call it a simple mathematical law, but the simple principle of organization. We review some of these examples in section 2, and then in section 3 in this paper, we consider the classic model of mutual synchronization. The analysis of this model over the past 25 years has drawn out a wonderful range of subjects, of course nonlinear dynamics, but also statistical mechanics and even plasma physics. And as we'll see, Norbert Wiener's spectrum has almost been explained in a mathematical sense, but not quite. So this spectrum in figure 1 that I showed you, that was something that people have tried to figure out and explain in a mathematical sense. They give some biological examples, ranging from pacemakers to Kerr-Model oscillators, and we won't go through that. But these are some of the afterthoughts and kind of thinking about how maybe some of the mathematical explanations for this. The intuitive leaps in Kuramoto's analysis deserve our admiration, but they have also provoked some vigorous head scratching. And this is, of course, the Kuramoto oscillator and the accompanying mathematical analysis. For example, what is one to make of Kuramoto's assumption that R is constant? The theorem must be something like this. For most initial conditions, for most realizations, and for large fractions of the time, R over time stays within a certain degree of the constant. It's an open problem to make this precise. So there's some precision issues with these models. This issue could be difficult, as Nancy Copel pointed out. It may be connected to questions about the foundations of statistical mechanics, irreversibility, Poincare recurrence, etc. So these are all kind of these issues in complexity theory that have to do with dynamics. And so, there are a lot of open questions in terms of looking at oscillators that are coupled and uncoupled. And so there's a lot of kind of fertile ground for this. So after 3 decades of research, the study of mutual synchronization is prospering theoretically, but like many branches of mathematical biology, it has wandered too far from its source. There is no serious confrontation between theory and experiment. We need to follow the example of 2 related fields, excitable media and central pattern generators. So the theory of excitable media has developed alongside experimental work on spiral and scroll waves and the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. Similarly, Ermentrout and Kopel's theory of phase locking in chains of oscillators has been directly motivated by experiments on the central pattern generator of Lamprey and has led to some surprising predictions that are recently verified by their experimental collaborators. But I suspect that mutual synchronization is going to be co-opted by physics, where the oscillators are closer to those imagined in their theories. There have already been some exciting applications to charge density waves into arrays of microwave oscillators and superconducting Josephson conjunctions. On second thought, perhaps co-opted is not the right word, since mutual synchronization began in physics with Huygens' discovery of phase locking between 2 pendula hung on the same board. And so they talk about theory here, and they talk about sort of how one can use oscillator networks to compute, learn, or recognize patterns. This subject should appeal to people caught up in the current excitement about neural networks. Abbott, in 1990, has taken a first step in this direction. So this is an oldish paper. I didn't know how old it was. The recent observation of stimulus-induced synchronization in the visual cortex has spawned several theories involving oscillator networks. Though there's still uncertainty about the biological significance of the experimental observations. But in any case, Norbert Wiener would be pleased to see that we're thinking about oscillators in the brain again.